The Zlorthian Empire had conquered precisely 14,732 species across the known universe. They kept meticulous records. Filing was, after all, the cornerstone of any successful galactic domination campaign. Quibbleton Mundlewick III sat hunched over his chrome-plated desk in subsection Q of the Department of Conquered Species Documentation, methodically updating Form 42B for the recently subjugated blobnoids of Kepler 452c. The blobnoids had lasted exactly 17 minutes against standard Zlorthian Protocol No. 7. The overwhelming display of technological superiority, followed by polite requests for immediate surrender. 17 minutes, Quibbleton muttered, adjusting his regulation spectacles. That's actually quite impressive. The tentacled philosophers of Rigel only managed 4 minutes and 37 seconds. What Quibbleton didn't know, as he filed away another civilization into the vast bureaucratic machinery of the Empire, was that somewhere in the filing system's deepest, dustiest corner, there existed a glaring oversight that would soon turn the entire universe upside down. The error had occurred during the great administrative restructuring of 2387, when Junior Assistant Deputy Clerk Flimperton Wadsworth had accidentally misfiled an entire solar system under pending review instead of conquered and catalogued. For 37 years, this little yellow folder labeled Sol System Third Planet Carbon-Based Bipeds had sat gathering dust between slightly aggressive mushroom people and those beings who communicate exclusively through interpretive dance. Meanwhile, on the third planet of the Sol System, humanity went about its business completely unaware that they were technically overdue for conquest by approximately 4 decades. The discovery happened on a Tuesday, which was already Quibbleton's least favorite day of the week. He was conducting his quarterly audit of the pending review section when he stumbled upon the forgotten folder. "What the blazes!" he exclaimed, causing nearby clerks to look up from their forms with mild annoyance. "How in the name of Supreme Overlord Globnik's left tentacle did we miss an entire species?" He opened the file with trembling fingers. The initial survey report was brief and thoroughly unimpressive. Small blue-green planet. Inhabitants appear to be confused about most things. Technological level, primitive. Threat assessment, negligible. Recommended conquest protocol, standard intimidation followed by administrative paperwork. But there was a problem. A big problem. According to Zlorthian Imperial Regulation 847C, all species must be conquered within 60 standard galactic days of discovery, or the conquest becomes irregular. And irregular conquests required Form 78X in triplicate, plus approval from the Board of Galactic Subjugation Oversight. Quibbleton's eye twitched. He hated Form 78X. Right then, he mumbled, reaching for his communication device. Time to fix this little administrative hiccup. 3 days later, the Zlorthian Expeditionary Force arrived at Earth with all the pomp and circumstance of a mid-level corporate merger. Commander Blagsworth Toffington deployed exactly 237 ships in precise formation above Earth's major population centers. This was standard protocol number 7, which had never failed. Not once. Not in 14,732 attempts. The first broadcast was transmitted in perfect galactic standard, as required by Imperial Communication Directive 15J. Greetings, primitive carbon-based life forms. We are the Zlorthian Empire. You have been selected for immediate conquest and subsequent integration into our glorious civilization. Please prepare surrender documents in triplicate and organize yourselves into manageable groups for processing. Thank you for your cooperation. The response from Earth was unexpected. Did they just hang up on us? Asked Sub-Commander Whifflebottom, staring at his communication panel in bewilderment. Impossible, replied Commander Toffington, adjusting his regulation conquest helmet. No species has ever hung up on a proper conquest announcement. Run a diagnostic on the communication array. Sir, the array is functioning perfectly. They definitely hung up on us. Ooh. What the Zlorthians didn't understand was that the broadcast had reached Earth during the middle of a particularly important football match, and most humans had assumed it was some kind of elaborate halftime show. In downtown Manchester, Gertrude Wimblebottom, a 73-year-old retired librarian, was having a perfectly ordinary Tuesday when enormous spaceships appeared over her city. She was in the middle of reorganizing her garden gnome collection when the shadow of the flagship blocked out her sun. "Oh, for crying out loud!" she shouted, shaking her fist at the sky. "I'm trying to organize my gnomes by height, you inconsiderate nincompoops. Take your flying contraption somewhere else." This was the first recorded human response to attempted Zlorthian conquest, and it would go down in Imperial history as the most baffling reaction in the annals of galactic domination. Commander Toffington was forced to consult the manual. The Zlorthian Guide to Universal Conquest was a hefty tome containing detailed protocols for every conceivable scenario. Chapter 47 covered responses to overwhelming displays of superior technology. The options included immediate surrender, delayed surrender after brief deliberation, surrender preceded by ritual dancing, and surrender accompanied by offering of local delicacies. Nowhere in the manual did it mention anything about garden gnome organization or being called nincompoops. "Sir," reported Communications Officer Dimpleton, "we're receiving multiple responses from the planet's surface. They're quite varied." "Read them out," ordered the commander, prepared for the usual catalogue of terror and submission. "From coordinates 514774 north, 0.4614 west. Bloody hell, not today. I've got a dental appointment." From coordinates 40.7589 north, 73. 9851 west. "Yeah, right, what's this, some kind of movie promotion?" From coordinates 35.6762 north or 139.6503 east. "Could you please move your ships? You're blocking the view of Mount Fuji." And from coordinates 55.9533 north, 3.1883 west. "Are you the ones responsible for my Wi-Fi being down?" Commander Toffington blinked slowly. Then he blinked again. According to the manual, this type of response fell under Category 847, incomprehensible native behavior, which required consultation with the Department of Xenopsychology. Back on Earth, humanity was having a remarkably ordinary day, considering that alien spaceships were hovering over every major city. The general consensus seemed to be that it was either a hoax, a movie production, or possibly both. Gertrude Wimblebottom, however, was having none of it. When a small Zlorthian reconnaissance craft landed in her back garden, crushing her prize-winning petunias, she marched out with a rolling pin and a face that could have curdled milk. "Right!" she bellowed at the emerging alien scout. "What's all this then? You've gone and squashed my petunias, you great metallic buffoon." Scout Lieutenant Wimperstein of the 47th Reconnaissance Division stood exactly 4 feet tall, possessed 6 eyes, and had successfully intimidated species across 3 galaxies. He had never, however, encountered a furious British pensioner wielding kitchen implements. "Greetings, primitive life form," he began, consulting his standard first contact protocols. "I am Scout Lieutenant Wimper." "I don't care if you're the bloody king of Mars," Gertrude interrupted, advancing with her rolling pin. "You've destroyed my petunias, and someone's going to pay for it." What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for generations to come. Lieutenant Wimperstein, trained to handle everything from psychic warrior monks to gas-based intelligence clouds, was completely undone by an elderly woman demanding compensation for damaged flowers. But the protocols don't," he stammered, his 6 eyes blinking in sequence like confused traffic lights. "Protocols! I'll give you protocols." Gertrude grabbed the lieutenant by what appeared to be his ear and began dragging him toward her garden shed. "You're going to help me replant every single petunia, And then you're going to explain to me why you thought it was acceptable to park your spaceship in someone's garden without so much as a by your leave. The next hour was perhaps the most surreal in the history of interspecies relations. Lieutenant Wimperstein, conqueror of star systems, found himself on his hands and knees in an English garden, carefully planting petunias under the watchful eye of a septuagenarian taskmaster. "That one's crooked," Gertrude pointed out. "And mind the roots, you ham-fisted space invader." By the time Commander Toffington received Lieutenant Wimperstein's report, half the Zlothian fleet was experiencing what military historians would later term profound operational confusion. "Let me understand this correctly," the commander said slowly. "Our advanced scout has been gardening." "Yes, sir. And apparently learning about proper tea preparation. The human insisted he couldn't work on an empty stomach. Tea preparation. Earl Grey, sir, with milk and 2 sugars. Commander Toffington felt a pain in what humans might have called his temple area. This was not going according to the manual. In fact, this was going so far off the manual that the manual might as well have been on a different planet. "Deploy the intimidation drones," he ordered. "Perhaps a show of force will bring these creatures to their senses." The intimidation drones were sleek, black, and specifically designed to inspire terror in primitive civilizations. They swooped down from the motherships with their energy weapons glowing menacingly, their speakers broadcasting ominous warnings in multiple languages. The humans' response was to start taking selfies. "Brilliant," shouted a teenager in Tokyo, posing next to a hovering drone. "This is going straight on Instagram." In London, a group of tourists asked a drone operator if they could get directions to Buckingham Palace. In New York, someone complained that the drones were too noisy and threatened to call the police about a noise violation. Commander Toffington watched the reports coming in with growing horror. According to Protocol 23F, the intimidation drones should have resulted in widespread panic, followed by desperate pleas for mercy. Instead, he was receiving reports of humans trying to sell the drones hot dogs and asking if they accepted credit cards. "Sir," reported his aide, "we're also receiving what appears to be criticism." Criticism! A human organization called TripAdvisor has left reviews of our invasion. Current rating 2 stars out of 5. Common complaints include poor timing, blocked traffic, disrupted lunch plans, and insufficient customer service. The commander stared at the report. In over 3,000 years of military service, he had conquered gas giants, defeated machine civilizations, and subdued psychic hive minds. He had never received a customer service review. "There's more, sir. A human news organization wants to interview you about your invasion experience, and another group is offering to book us for birthday parties." "Birthday parties?" "Apparently we're considered themed entertainment, sir." Back in her garden, Gertrude was having quite a pleasant afternoon. Lieutenant Wimperstein, it turned out, was an excellent listener and surprisingly good at garden maintenance once you explained things properly. "You know," she said, handing him a fresh cup of tea, "this whole invasion business seems terribly inefficient. Have you considered simply asking people if they'd like to join your empire?" "Asking?" The lieutenant's 6 eyes blinked in confusion. "But the protocols clearly state that conquest requires demonstration of superior force, followed by submission." "Poppycock!" Gertrude waved her hand dismissively. "Half the people I know would join an alien empire just for the novelty of it. Mrs. Henderson next door is always complaining about the government anyway. I bet she'd sign up in a heartbeat if you offered better health care." Lieutenant Wimperstein nearly choked on his tea. "Better health care? Oh yes, and proper public transport. Do you have proper public transport in your empire? Because the bus service here is dreadful." This conversation was being transmitted directly back to the command ship, where Commander Toffington was experiencing what military physicians would later diagnose as an acute case of strategic bewilderment syndrome. "She wants to know about our public transport system?" he asked his aide. Yes, sir. Also waste management, education policies, and whether we offer dental coverage. Dental coverage? We're trying to conquer them. The human seems to think conquest and healthcare administration are related topics, sir. Meanwhile, across Earth, humanity was adapting to the alien presence with characteristic pragmatism. Street vendors in London were selling "I survived the alien invasion" t-shirts. A group of university students in Boston had started a betting pool on how long the aliens would stay. In Tokyo, a ramen shop had created a new dish called Galactic Conquest Special and was doing record business. The Zlothian invasion was, in short, being thoroughly domesticated. Commander Toffington made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He consulted the Emergency Protocols section of the manual, specifically Emergency Protocol 77, when standard conquest procedures fail completely. Protocol 77 was simple: escalate to Phase 2. Phase 2 involved the deployment of the Zlothian Empire's most fearsome weapon, the bureaucracy gun. The bureaucracy gun was a marvel of administrative warfare. It bombarded target populations with forms, regulations, compliance requirements, and paperwork until the native species surrendered out of sheer frustration with the filing system. The weapon charged for 6 hours, gathering bureaucratic energy from across the galaxy. When it fired, it released a concentrated beam of pure administrative confusion directly at Earth. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every human on the planet suddenly received, via mysterious means, a stack of forms 6 feet high. The forms were in triplicate, required signatures in 17 different places, and needed to be completed within 48 hours or face penalties under Galactic Administrative Code 789X. For any other species in the galaxy, this would have meant instant surrender. The tentacled philosophers of Rigel had given up after receiving just 3 forms. Humanity's response was unexpected. "Oh, finally!" exclaimed Harold Pemberton, a retired accountant from Surrey. "Some proper paperwork. Look at the attention to detail. The cross-referencing system is magnificent." In offices around the world, administrative assistants cracked their knuckles and grinned. This was the challenge they'd been waiting for their entire careers. "Margaret!" shouted an office manager in Chicago. "Get the good pens. We've got serious forms to fill out." Within 12 hours, not only had humanity completed all the required forms, they had also submitted suggestions for improvement, created an efficient filing system, and sent back supplementary documentation they thought might be helpful. Commander Toffington received a report that made his tentacles curl with confusion. "Sir, the humans have not only completed all required forms, but they've also improved them. And they've sent us a bill for consulting services." "A bill?" "They claim that our administrative procedures were inefficient and poorly structured, and they've charged us for organizational optimization. The total comes to 47,000 galactic credits. 47,000, plus expenses for tea and biscuits consumed during the completion process." The commander stared at the invoice. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, someone had added, "Thank you for choosing Human Administrative Services. We hope to work with you again soon." This was impossible. In the 3,000-year history of the Zlothian Empire, no species had ever sent them an invoice. While Commander Toffington was having what could generously be called a nervous breakdown, Gertrude Wimblebottom was hosting what would become known as the first interspecies garden party in human history. Lieutenant Wimperstein had called for reinforcements to help with what he described as urgent horticultural operations. Soon, Gertrude's back garden was full of alien soldiers learning the proper way to prune roses and the importance of adequate drainage for vegetables. "The secret to good tomatoes," Gertrude explained to a group of attentive Zlothian warriors, "is proper soil preparation. You can't just plop them in any old dirt and expect results." "Soil preparation," repeated Sergeant Bumblethwaite, taking careful notes. And timing. You've got to plant at the right time of year, or you'll get nothing but disappointment and withered leaves. The irony was lost on no one except the Zlothians themselves. The most successful military force in galactic history was receiving tactical advice about vegetables from a British pensioner. News of the garden party spread through the alien fleet faster than bad news in a small town. Soon, Zlothian soldiers were requesting shore leave to attend what they called educational agricultural seminars. Commander Toffington watched from his command bridge as his invasion force gradually transformed into the galaxy's most well-trained gardening crew. "Sir," reported his aide, "the humans have extended an invitation for you to attend something called afternoon tea. They say it's important for diplomatic relations." Diplomatic relations? We're supposed to be conquering them. The invitation specifically mentions cucumber sandwiches, sir. The commander paused. He had heard about cucumber sandwiches. They were mentioned in several classified reports from previous invasions as a form of psychological warfare too subtle for Zlothian understanding. "Very well," he said finally, "but this is strictly reconnaissance. I need to understand their cucumber-based strategy." An hour later, Commander Blagsworth Toffington, terror of the galaxy, conqueror of star systems, found himself sitting in Gertrude Wimblebottom's living room, balanced precariously on a floral-patterned sofa, holding a delicate china teacup. "Sugar?" asked Gertrude politely. Yes, thank you," replied the commander, trying to figure out how to hold the tiny spoon with his massive claws. "Lovely weather we're having, isn't it?" Gertrude continued, as if hosting alien invaders for tea was the most natural thing in the world. "Yes, quite. Wait," the commander blinked. "Aren't you afraid? Terrified? Shouldn't you be cowering in bunkers or something?" Gertrude looked at him with the kind of patience usually reserved for explaining things to very small children. "My dear," she said, "I've lived through rationing, the Blitz, 3 economic recessions, and 47 years of marriage to Herbert Wimblebottom, who never once put the toilet seat down. It takes more than a few spaceships to rattle me. But we're here to conquer your planet." "Are you?" Gertrude raised an eyebrow, "because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're here to have tea and learn about proper plant care. Which I must say is a much more civilized approach to interspecies relations." Commander Toffington felt something crack inside his brain. Everything he had learned about conquest, everything the military academy had taught him, everything in the manual was wrong. These humans weren't behaving like a conquered species. They weren't even behaving like they noticed they were being conquered. But the protocols," he stammered. "Oh, protocols!" Gertrude waved dismissively. "I've been dealing with protocols for 73 years. Council protocols, tax protocols, NHS protocols, pension protocols. Yours are actually quite well organized compared to the local planning committee. You've seen our protocols?" "Of course. That lovely young man, what was his name, Lieutenant Wimperstein, showed me the whole manual. Fascinating reading, really, though I did notice a few inefficiencies." The commander's teacup rattled against its saucer. "Inefficiencies? Oh yes. For instance, you spend far too much time on the intimidation phase. Most people respond much better to a nice cup of tea and a polite explanation. And your filing system? Well, it's impressive but terribly complicated. I've streamlined it considerably." "You've streamlined our filing system? Added cross-references, improved the indexing, created a more logical hierarchy." Lieutenant Wimperstein was thrilled. He said it cut his paperwork time by 60%. Midi, at that moment, Commander Toffington experienced what humans might recognize as an existential crisis. His entire worldview, built on the fundamental principle that conquest required overwhelming force and bureaucratic intimidation, was crumbling like a poorly made biscuit. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "We've conquered 14,732 species. The same way. Every time. It always works." Gertrude leaned forward with the expression of someone about to share a profound truth. "Perhaps," she said gently, The other species were just too polite to mention that your approach was a bit silly. The word silly hit Commander Toffington like an asteroid to the face. In his entire military career, no one had ever called the mighty Zlothian Empire silly. Silly? He repeated weakly. Well, yes. All this flying about in enormous ships, making threatening announcements, firing weapons into empty space. It's rather like a toddler having a tantrum, isn't it? Very loud, very dramatic, but not particularly effective. But we're the most feared military force in the galaxy. Are you? Gertrude looked genuinely curious. Or are you the most tolerated? There's quite a difference, you know. This question would keep Commander Toffington awake for the next 6 months. Back on the command ship, the rest of the Zlothian fleet was experiencing its own crisis of confidence. Reports were coming in from across Earth, describing similar encounters. Humans everywhere were treating the invasion as if it were somewhere between a mild inconvenience and an interesting cultural exchange. In Paris, a group of Zlothian shock troops had been conscripted into helping move furniture for an elderly couple who insisted they looked strong enough to lift a wardrobe. And in Sydney, an entire squadron had been convinced to participate in a beach volleyball tournament, with the promise that the winners would receive proper respect for their superior athleticism. In Mumbai, the local Zlothian commander had been adopted by a family who decided he looked too thin and needed proper feeding up. Sub-Commander Whifflebottom approached his superior with the latest reports, his expression suggesting he was having trouble processing reality. "Sir," he said carefully, "I'm receiving requests from 17 different units asking for extended shore leave." "Shore leave? We're in the middle of a conquest." "Yes, sir. But apparently the humans have invited them to something called a barbecue, and they're quite keen to attend. They say it's important for cultural understanding." "Cultural understanding?" "And, sir, the humans have started a petition." Commander Toffington felt his left eye begin to twitch. "What kind of petition?" "They want us to stay permanently. Apparently we're excellent at household maintenance and surprisingly good company. The petition has over 2 million signatures and is trending on something called social media. They want us to stay? They've offered to set up a permanent cultural exchange program. In return for help with infrastructure projects, they'll provide what they call proper hospitality and decent food. Several of our officers have submitted formal applications." The commander stared out at Earth, rotating peacefully below his fleet. Somewhere down there, the most successful military force in galactic history was learning to make scrambled eggs and debating the merits of different tea brands. "Sir," his aide ventured, "what are your orders?" Commander Toffington was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question that would change the course of galactic history. Do you think we might have been doing this wrong?" Meanwhile, in a small office building in Geneva, an emergency session of what would later be called the Human-Zlothian Integration Committee was taking place. The committee consisted of Gertrude Wimblebottom, elected chairwoman by unanimous vote, Lieutenant Wimperstein, secretary and note-taker, Harold Pemberton, treasurer and forms coordinator, and Mrs. Henderson from next door, refreshments manager. "Right then," said Gertrude, calling the meeting to order with a sharp tap of her knitting needle on the table. "Let's discuss the terms of this integration business." "Integration?" asked Lieutenant Wimperstein, his 6 eyes blinking nervously. "Well, you can't very well go back to your empire and tell them you failed to conquer us, can you? That would be terribly embarrassing. And we can't have you hovering about, indefinitely making the place look untidy. So we need a solution that works for everyone." Harold Pemberton adjusted his glasses and consulted his notes. "I've drawn up a preliminary agreement, subject to negotiation, of course." "Ooh, negotiations!" Mrs. Henderson clapped her hands together. "I do love a good negotiation. Will there be biscuits?" "Always biscuits at a proper negotiation," Gertrude confirmed. "Now then, Harold, let's hear your proposal." Harold cleared his throat. "Article 1. The Zlothian Empire hereby acknowledges that Earth has been successfully incorporated into their galactic civilization through the revolutionary new method of voluntary cultural exchange. Voluntary cultural exchange, Lieutenant Wimperstein repeated, making careful notes. Article 2. In exchange for advanced technology, infrastructure assistance, and help with heavy lifting, Earth agrees to provide the Zlorthian Empire with improved administrative procedures, proper catering, and lessons in practical social interaction. That seems fair, mused Gertrude. What else? Article 3. All future galactic conquests will be conducted using the new English method, which involves polite requests, adequate documentation, and at least one shared meal before any formal agreements are signed. Lieutenant Wimperstein's hand was cramping from taking notes. The English method? Much more civilized than all that shooting and shouting, Gertrude explained. People respond better to courtesy. And Article 4, Harold continued, establishes the universal right to proper tea, regardless of species or planetary origin. Brilliant! Exclaimed Mrs. Henderson. I'll put the kettle on. As she bustled off to prepare tea, Lieutenant Wimperstein looked up from his notes with an expression of wonder. Do you really think this will work? He asked. My dear boy, said Gertrude with the confidence of someone who had successfully organized village fetes for 30 years, the key to any successful relationship is proper communication and shared responsibilities. You Zlorthians are very good at organization, and we humans are very good at, well, being human. Together we should manage quite nicely. What none of them realized was that their little committee meeting was being broadcast live across the Zlorthian Empire through Lieutenant Wimperstein's communication device. Every Zlorthian commander, admiral, and bureaucrat in the galaxy was listening to a septuagenarian British woman revolutionize military strategy over tea and biscuits. On distant Zlorthian worlds, military academies were frantically rewriting their textbooks. The Department of Conquered Species Documentation was having collective nervous breakdowns as they tried to figure out how to file a species that had conquered itself. And in the deepest archives of the Imperial Library, ancient Zlorthian scholars were discovering something that made their tentacles curl with embarrassment. In 3,000 years of galactic conquest, they had never once asked any species if they wanted to be conquered. The concept was so alien, it didn't even have a word in Zlorthian. Commander Toffington stood on his bridge, watching the impossible unfold below him. His invasion fleet was being systematically converted into the galaxy's most polite construction crew. His soldiers were learning to make proper sandwiches. His lieutenants were taking notes on flower arrangement. And the worst part, they all seemed happy about it. "Sir," reported his communications officer, "we're receiving a message from Imperial Command." The commander straightened. Finally, orders from headquarters. Someone with sense would sort out this madness. "Put them through," he ordered. The holographic image of Supreme Admiral Globtastic materialized on the bridge, his ceremonial tentacles writhing with what Commander Toffington assumed was righteous fury. "Commander Toffington!" the Admiral bellowed. "What in the name of the 7 sacred bureaucracies is going on down there?" "Sir, I can explain." "Explain? You've been invaded by tea parties. Your soldiers are learning to garden. Half the Imperial fleet is requesting transfers to Earth because they want to learn something called proper cooking." "Sir, the humans have a different approach. They've turned our entire invasion force into domestic help. The Emperor himself is asking questions, Commander. Awkward questions." Commander Toffington felt his career prospects evaporating like morning dew. "Sir, perhaps if you understood the situation—" "Oh, I understand the situation perfectly, Commander. You've discovered something that threatens the very foundation of our empire. Do you know what the other conquered species are saying?" "No, sir. They're asking why they didn't get the tea and biscuits treatment. The tentacled philosophers are filing formal complaints. The blorbnoids are demanding a do-over. The entire galaxy is in administrative chaos." Commander Toffington blinked. "Administrative chaos. Half our subjects want to renegotiate their conquest terms. The other half are threatening to conquer US using what they're calling the human method. Do you have any idea how to handle a polite invasion? The commander admitted that he did not. Exactly! We've spent 3,000 years perfecting intimidation and bureaucratic confusion. We don't know the first thing about nice conquest. The entire Imperial War College is in crisis. On the screen, Supreme Admiral Globtastic's tentacles were flailing in what could only be described as bureaucratic panic. "Sir," Commander Toffington said carefully, "what are your orders?" There was a long pause. When the Admiral spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 3 millennia of military tradition crumbling into dust. "Find out how they do it, Commander. Learn everything you can about this English method. And Toffington?" "Yes, sir?" "If they offer you tea, take notes." The transmission ended, leaving Commander Toffington alone with the most impossible order in military history. Learn how to conquer people by being nice to them. Down on Earth, the Humans Zlothian Integration Committee had moved their operations to Gertrude's back garden, which had become the unofficial headquarters of the first successful reverse conquest in galactic history. "The key," Gertrude was explaining to a group of fascinated Zlothian officers, "is to make people feel valued. Everyone wants to contribute something meaningful. Your mistake was assuming that conquest meant taking things from people instead of giving things to them." Lieutenant Colonel Bumbershoot, veteran of 47 successful invasions, raised a tentacle tentatively. "But how do you maintain order without proper intimidation protocols?" "Order?" Gertrude laughed. "My dear fellow, you can't force order. Order comes from everyone agreeing that cooperation is better than chaos, and people will only agree to that if they feel they're getting something worthwhile in return." "Something worthwhile?" "Better roads, decent health care, efficient public transport, good schools. You know, the things that actually matter to people trying to live their lives." Harold Pemberton looked up from his calculations. "I've been reviewing your imperial administrative costs, and frankly, they're astronomical. Do you have any idea how much you spend on intimidation equipment annually?" "Approximately 47 billion galactic credits," replied Lieutenant Wimperstein promptly. 47 billion. Good Lord, you could build entire civilizations for that amount. No wonder your empire is always having budget problems. The Zlothian officers exchanged glances. Budget problems were indeed a recurring issue in the Empire, though they'd never connected them to their military expenses. "But surely," protested Captain Wimsington, "some species require forceful persuasion." Mrs. Henderson poured tea thoughtfully. "Have you ever actually asked them what they want?" "Asked them?" "Yes, asked them. You know, hello, we're the Zlothian Empire. We have advanced technology and efficient administration. Would you be interested in joining us for mutual benefit?" That sort of thing. The concept was so revolutionary that several officers had to sit down. "You mean," said Lieutenant Colonel Bumbershoot slowly, "instead of threatening them with conquest, we could invite them to participate?" "Exactly," exclaimed Gertrude. "People love being invited to things, makes them feel important." What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary afternoon in the history of interspecies relations. A group of battle-hardened Zlothian veterans sat in an English garden, drinking tea and learning the fundamental principles of polite civilization from a collection of retired humans who treated galactic conquest like a particularly interesting village project. "The thing about humans," explained Harold, "is that we've had thousands of years to perfect the art of getting along with each other. Oh, we still mess it up regularly, but we've learned a few things along the way." "Such as?" asked Lieutenant Wimperstein, notebook ready. "Well, for starters, nobody likes being told what to do, but everyone likes being asked for help. Frame your requests properly, and people will volunteer for the most extraordinary things." "Give them an example," suggested Mrs. Henderson. Harold thought for a moment. "Right. Instead of saying, 'You are now part of our empire and must obey our laws,' you say, 'We're establishing a new galactic community, and we'd love to have your species participate. What unique contributions could you bring to make it better for everyone? Unique contributions. Captain Whimsington's tentacles twitched with interest. Every species has something special to offer, Gertrude added. The trick is finding out what that is and making them feel proud of it, much more effective than threatening them with laser cannons. As if summoned by the mention of laser cannons, Commander Toffington himself appeared in the garden, having finally worked up the courage to attend one of these legendary tea sessions. "Ah, Commander," Gertrude greeted him warmly. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing proper diplomatic protocols." Tea? The commander, conqueror of star systems, accepted a delicate porcelain cup with hands that only trembled slightly. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what you said earlier, about us being tolerated rather than feared." "And?" Gertrude prompted encouragingly. "Well, I've been reviewing our conquest records, and I've noticed something disturbing. After the initial subjugation, most species become remarkably compliant, almost boringly so." Boringly. Harold looked up from his biscuit. "They stop creating art, stop developing new technologies, stop being interesting. They just exist and follow our regulations." Mrs. Henderson tutted sympathetically. "Well, of course they do, poor things. What's the point of being creative when nothing you do matters? Creativity requires hope, doesn't it? Hope? The belief that your actions can make things better. Take that away and people just give up." Commander Toffington felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Are you saying that our entire empire is populated by species who have given up?" "I'm afraid it sounds rather like it," Gertrude said gently. "But the good news is, it's entirely fixable." "Fixable? Oh yes. People are remarkably resilient. Give them a reason to care again, and they'll surprise you with what they can accomplish." Lieutenant Wimperstein looked up from his notes. "How do we give them a reason to care?" "Simple," said Harold. "Ask them what they want to do, then help them do it." This concept was so alien to Zlorthian thinking that several officers experienced what could only be described as philosophical vertigo. "You mean," said Captain Whimsington slowly, "instead of telling conquered species what we need them to do, we ask them what they want to do?" "Exactly. And then you find ways to connect their interests with the Empire's needs. Much more efficient than forced compliance." Commander Toffington was beginning to understand why his invasion had gone so spectacularly wrong. The humans weren't just refusing to be conquered in the traditional sense. They were demonstrating that the traditional sense was completely backwards. "But how do we maintain imperial unity if everyone is doing what they want?" he asked. Gertrude smiled. "The same way a good community works, dear. You establish common goals that benefit everyone, and you make sure everyone understands how their contribution helps achieve those goals. Common goals, better communication between worlds, improved transportation, shared scientific research, cultural exchange, that sort of thing. Things that make life better for everyone involved." Harold nodded enthusiastically. "I've been reviewing your imperial infrastructure, and honestly, it's quite impressive. But it's all designed for control rather than service. A few adjustments to prioritize citizen welfare, and you'd have the most successful civilization in galactic history." Citizen welfare. The words felt strange in Commander Toffington's mouth. "Happy citizens are productive citizens," Mrs. Henderson explained. "Productive citizens create wealth and innovation. Wealth and innovation make empires strong. It's really quite straightforward." "But what about rebellions, uprisings, chaos?" Gertrude waved dismissively. "People only rebel when they're miserable and see no other option. Make them happy and give them constructive ways to improve their situation, and rebellion becomes pointless." "You're suggesting," said Commander Toffington slowly, "that the most effective way to control an empire is to not control it. Not control it in the traditional sense, no. Guide it, support it, facilitate it, but not control it." The commander sat in stunned silence, his teacup growing cold in his hands. Everything he had believed about power, about leadership, about empire building was crumbling like a stale biscuit. "I need to contact Imperial Command," he said finally. "Of course, dear," said Gertrude, "but do try to explain it properly. We wouldn't want them to panic." An hour later, Commander Toffington stood on his bridge, preparing to make the most important communication of his career. On the screen before him, the assembled High Command of the Zlothian Empire waited with expressions of barely controlled impatience. "Well, Commander," demanded Supreme Admiral Globtastic, "what have you learned about this human method?" Commander Toffington took a deep breath. "Sir, I believe we have been approaching galactic conquest from entirely the wrong direction." "Wrong direction?" "Yes, sir. The humans have shown us that forced compliance, while initially effective, ultimately produces diminishing returns. Voluntary cooperation, however, creates exponential benefits for all parties involved." Voluntary cooperation? That's not conquest, that's civilization, sir. The silence that followed could have been measured in geological epochs. "Civilization," repeated Admiral Globtastic faintly. "Yes, sir. The humans suggest that instead of conquering species, we invite them to participate in building something better together, something where everyone benefits." "And this works?" "Sir, in the past week, Earth has voluntarily implemented 17 new administrative efficiency protocols, shared 43 technological innovations, and increased our fleet's operational effectiveness by 30%. All while serving excellent meals and maintaining remarkably high morale among our troops." Died. Another silence, broken only by the sound of tentacles shifting nervously. "Commander," said Admiral Globtastic carefully, "are you telling me that we could have achieved better results by simply asking species to join us?" "It appears so, sir. For 3,000 years, we could have been asking nicely. The evidence suggests that yes, sir." What followed was what historians would later term the Great Zlothian Reconsideration. Across the empire, military leaders, administrators, and bureaucrats were forced to confront the possibility that their entire approach to galactic civilization had been not just wrong, but spectacularly, embarrassingly, catastrophically wrong. On Earth, news of the empire-wide crisis reached the Integration Committee via Lieutenant Wimperstein's communication device. "Oh my," said Gertrude, listening to reports of planets demanding renegotiated treaties and military academies restructuring their entire curricula. "We seem to have started something of a revolution." "A good revolution, though," Harold pointed out. "The kind that makes things better rather than just different." Mrs. Henderson was practical as always. "We'll need more tea, and probably more biscuits. Revolution is hungry work." What nobody expected was the arrival 3 days later of the Zlothian Emperor himself. Emperor Magnificus Omnipotentus, the 847th, descended from his golden flagship in full ceremonial regalia, accompanied by a retinue of advisors, generals, and what appeared to be a small army of bureaucrats carrying filing cabinets. He was met at the landing site by Gertrude Wimblebottom, wearing her best cardigan and carrying a thermos of tea. "Your Imperial Magnificence," she said with a polite curtsy. "How lovely to meet you. I'm Gertrude. Would you care for some tea? You must be exhausted after such a long journey." Emperor Magnificus Omnipotentus, the 847th, absolute ruler of 14,732 worlds, stopped dead in his tracks. Nobody had ever offered him tea before. Tea," he repeated. "Earl Grey or English breakfast? I've brought both just in case." The Emperor looked at his retinue of advisors, all of whom were consulting their manuals frantically. None of them contained protocols for accepting beverage offers from elderly humans. "Earl Grey sounds pleasant," he said finally. And so it was that the most powerful being in the galaxy found himself sitting in a modest English garden, drinking tea from a china cup that had been a wedding present in 1973, while a septuagenarian explained to him why his entire empire was built on fundamentally flawed principles. "The thing is, Your Magnificence," Gertrude said kindly, "fear is a terribly inefficient motivator. It works in the short term, but it's exhausting to maintain, and it prevents people from doing their best work." Their best work? Well, yes. If people are afraid, they'll do the minimum required to avoid punishment, but if they're inspired, they'll do remarkable things just because they want to. Emperor Magnificus Omnipotentus, the 847th, had ruled for over 2 centuries. In all that time, no one had ever suggested that his subjects might be capable of remarkable things. "You believe," he said slowly, "that our subjects have been underperforming?" "Oh, undoubtedly. Fear makes people stupid, stifles creativity, prevents innovation, kills enthusiasm. I'd be willing to bet that most of your worlds are producing a fraction of what they could if people felt genuinely excited about contributing to something meaningful." Harold Pemberton looked up from his latest set of calculations. "I've been analyzing productivity data from across your empire, Your Magnificence, and the numbers are quite telling." "Telling?" "Species that were conquered more recently show higher productivity rates than those subjugated centuries ago. The pattern suggests that extended exposure to fear-based governance leads to systematic decline in innovation and output." The Emperor's tentacles drooped noticeably. "Are you saying that our empire is dying?" "Dying is a strong word," Gertrude said diplomatically. "I'd say it's more falling asleep. But the wonderful thing about sleep is that you can always wake up." "Wake up." Mrs. Henderson joined the conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who had found a particularly interesting project. "What we're suggesting, Your Magnificence, is an empire-wide renewal. Imagine what 14,000 worlds could accomplish if everyone was working together toward common goals they actually cared about." "Common goals they cared about," the Emperor repeated, as if testing the words in an unfamiliar language. "Exploration, scientific advancement, artistic collaboration, cultural exchange." Harold's eyes lit up behind his glasses. "You have the infrastructure for the greatest civilization in galactic history. You just need to redirect it slightly." "Redirect it?" "From conquest to cooperation," Gertrude explained. "From fear to inspiration. From you must to would you like to." Emperor Magnificus Omnipotentus, the 847th, sat in thoughtful silence, his tea growing cold as he contemplated the complete restructuring of everything he had ever known about governance. "This would require," he said finally, "fundamental changes to our entire administrative system." "Oh, yes," Harold agreed cheerfully. "Complete overhaul of governmental philosophy, restructuring of military priorities, retraining of administrative personnel, establishment of new communication protocols, implementation of citizen feedback systems. Quite a substantial project, really." "It sounds," said the Emperor faintly, "like the most complex undertaking in galactic history." "Probably is," Gertrude acknowledged, "but also the most worthwhile. And you won't be doing it alone." "Alone?" "Well, no. You'll have help from every species in the Empire. After all, they're the ones who know best what they need to thrive." This concept, that his subjects might actually be partners rather than possessions, struck the Emperor with the force of a philosophical meteor. "Partners," he said quietly. "Partners," Gertrude confirmed. "Much more interesting than subjects, don't you think?" What happened next became known throughout the galaxy as the Great Asking. Emperor Magnificus Omnipotentus, the 847th, sent a message to every world in his empire. Not a decree, not a demand, not an order. A question. "What would you like to do?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. After centuries of forced silence, every species in the galaxy suddenly had opinions, ideas, dreams, and suggestions. The Imperial Communication Network, designed for one-way transmission of orders, nearly collapsed under the volume of incoming messages. The tentacled philosophers of Rigel wanted to establish an interplanetary university for advanced metaphysical studies. The Blorbnoids requested funding for a galactic art installation project. The crystal entities of Vega proposed an empire-wide network for instantaneous communication. The gas clouds of the Horsehead Nebula suggested collaborative weather management for agricultural worlds. Species that hadn't spoken to each other in millennia began forming working groups, research partnerships, and cultural exchange programs. On Earth, the Integration Committee found itself suddenly promoted to the position of official Imperial consultants on voluntary cooperation. "This is getting rather out of hand," Gertrude observed, watching reports stream in from across the galaxy. "Wonderfully out of hand," Harold corrected, his desk buried under project proposals. "Do you realize what we've done? We've accidentally created the largest volunteer organization in the universe." Mrs. Henderson was in her element, coordinating tea deliveries to overwhelmed administrators across 17 star systems. "I'll need more biscuits," she announced. "Industrial quantities of biscuits." Lieutenant Wimperstein, now promoted to Director of Human Zlothian Cultural Exchange, was frantically trying to process requests for human method training from military academies across the galaxy. "They want to learn about tea ceremonies," he reported, "and something called proper queue etiquette. Also, there are 47 requests for instruction in polite conversation techniques." Emperor Magnificus Omnipotentus, the 847th, meanwhile, was experiencing what could only be described as imperial culture shock. For the first time in his reign, he was receiving progress reports that were actually exciting to read. "Your Magnificence," reported his newly appointed Minister of Voluntary Initiatives, "the crystalline architects have proposed a joint project with the gaseous engineers to create self-sustaining atmospheric processes. The preliminary designs suggest a 300% increase in terraforming efficiency." 300%. "Yes, sir. And the aquatic philosophers have volunteered to collaborate on long-term environmental impact studies. They're quite enthusiastic about the project." "Enthusiastic," the Emperor repeated wonderingly. "When was the last time anyone described our subjects as enthusiastic?" "Never, sir. It's not in the historical records." The transformation wasn't without its challenges. 3,000 years of authoritarian bureaucracy couldn't be dismantled overnight, and many administrators struggled with the concept of asking rather than ordering. "But how do I ask them to file their reports on time?" demanded Bureaucrat Superior Flimpleton during a particularly chaotic training session. "You explain why timely reports are important," Gertrude replied patiently, "and you ask them to help you maintain the system that benefits everyone. But what if they say no? Then you ask them what's preventing them from filing on time and work together to solve the problem. Work together to solve problems?" Flimpleton looked as if the concept might cause his brain to explode. "It's much more effective than punishment," Harold pointed out. "Punishment only addresses symptoms. Problem-solving addresses causes. But punishment is so much simpler." "Simple, yes. Effective, no. Would you rather do something simple that doesn't work or something slightly more complex that works beautifully?" These training sessions were being broadcast empire-wide, and the responses were illuminating. Species that had been following orders without question for centuries were suddenly rediscovering initiative, creativity, and collaborative problem-solving. The economic effects were immediate and dramatic. When people started working because they wanted to, rather than because they had to, productivity didn't just increase, it exploded. The Zlothian Empire's GDP grew by 400% in the first year of the Great Asking. Crime rates plummeted across all worlds as people found constructive outlets for their energy and ambitions. Scientific advancement accelerated at unprecedented rates as researchers from different species began collaborating freely. Art, music, literature, and cultural expression flourished as creative beings were finally free to explore their passions. But perhaps most importantly, for the first time in 3 millennia, people throughout the galaxy were happy. Emperor Magnificus Omnipotentus, the 847th, found himself in the unprecedented position of ruling an empire where his subjects actually liked being part of it. "Your Magnificence," his advisors reported during their weekly briefing, "we're receiving requests from neighboring galaxies asking how they can implement similar systems. Neighboring galaxies want to join us? Not exactly join us, sir. They want to learn from us. Several have requested diplomatic missions to study our new administrative methods." The Emperor looked out at the stars, contemplating the magnitude of what had begun in a small English garden with an offer of tea and biscuits. "Schedule the meetings," he said finally, "and make sure there are proper refreshments. I understand that diplomatic relations work much better when people are comfortable." 6 months later, representatives from 37 different galactic civilizations gathered on Earth for the first intergalactic conference on voluntary cooperation and proper tea service. Gertrude Wimblebottom, now bearing the official title of Supreme Advisor on Human Method Implementation, though she still preferred to be called simply Gertrude, opened the conference with characteristic directness. "Right then," she said, surveying the assembled delegates representing trillions of beings across multiple galaxies. "Who wants to learn how to ask nicely?" The response was unanimous and enthusiastic. 3 years later, the galaxy had become an unrecognizably different place. The Zlothian Empire had transformed into the Galactic Cooperative Alliance, a voluntary association of species working together on projects that benefited everyone. Wars had become obsolete, replaced by collaborative problem-solving sessions. Poverty had virtually disappeared as resources were distributed based on need rather than conquest. Scientific advancement had progressed more in 3 years than in the previous 3 centuries, and throughout it all, Gertrude Wimblebottom continued to tend her garden, host tea parties for visiting dignitaries, and offer practical advice to anyone who asked. "The secret," she told a group of young Zlothian administrators during one of her regular training sessions, "is remembering that everyone, no matter how different they might seem, wants fundamentally the same things: to feel valued, to contribute something meaningful, and to be treated with respect." "But what about species that are genuinely hostile?" asked one earnest young officer. "Hostile species," Gertrude replied, with the wisdom of someone who had successfully mediated disputes between squirrels and sparrows in her bird feeder, "are usually just frightened species with poor communication skills. The trick is figuring out what they're afraid of and helping them feel safe enough to express it properly." Lieutenant Wimperstein, now a full colonel and director of interspecies relations, nodded agreement. "We've found that most hostile species just needed someone to listen to their concerns. Amazing what people will agree to when they feel heard." Harold Pemberton looked up from his latest efficiency report. "The numbers don't lie. Cooperation produces better results than coercion in literally every measurable category. Military expenditure down 97%, productivity up 600%, citizen satisfaction approaching universal levels. And," added Mrs. Henderson practically, "everyone's much nicer at dinner parties." Emperor Magnificus Omnipotentus, the 847th, who had officially renamed himself Emperor Magnificus Cooperativus the First to reflect the new imperial philosophy, visited Earth regularly to consult with his human advisors. "I never understood," he confided to Gertrude during one particularly pleasant afternoon in her garden, "how much energy we were wasting on maintaining fear. It's exhausting trying to keep people afraid all the time. Much easier to keep people happy," Gertrude agreed. "Happy people take care of themselves and each other. Very efficient system, really." "The other galactic emperors think I've gone completely mad," he admitted. "Have you?" The Emperor considered this seriously. "Possibly, but it's a very productive kind of madness. The kind that builds things instead of destroying them. The best kind of madness, then. As the sun set over Gertrude's garden, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, alien visitors from dozens of worlds helped pack away teacups and fold up chairs, chatting amicably about their various collaborative projects. Commander Toffington, now Admiral Toffington and Director of Peaceful Integration Protocols, approached Gertrude with a question that had been troubling him. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what would have happened if we had never found Earth, if that filing error had never been discovered?" Gertrude considered this as she watered her petunias, the descendants of the flowers that Lieutenant Wimperstein had accidentally crushed all those years ago. "I think," she said finally, "someone would have figured it out eventually. People have a way of finding better solutions when the old ones stop working. It just happened to be us, in this garden, on this particular Tuesday. But the galaxy is fundamentally different now. Trillions of beings living better lives because of a misfiled folder and a cup of tea." "Yes," Gertrude smiled. "Funny how the smallest things can change everything, isn't it?" As the evening stars appeared overhead, representatives from across the galaxy headed back to their ships, their worlds, their projects and dreams. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for cooperation, new possibilities for making the universe a better place for everyone. In the distance, Zlorthian ships glided silently through the night sky, no longer symbols of conquest, but partners in the greatest collaborative project in cosmic history, the simple, revolutionary idea that asking nicely works better than forcing compliance. Gertrude Wimblebottom, Supreme Architect of Galactic Peace, retired to her cottage with a satisfied smile and a cup of tea, leaving behind a universe forever changed by the radical notion that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and respect. The most feared military force in galactic history had been defeated not by superior weapons or brilliant strategy, but by an elderly woman with a tea service and the revolutionary idea that people respond better to courtesy than to conquest.